August 27th, 1896, 9:02 in the morning. 5 British warships sit motionless in the harbor of Zanzibar, guns trained on a palace. Inside that palace, a man has declared himself Sultan and refused a British ultimatum. The deadline passes. At 9:02 and 45 seconds, the British open fire. 38 minutes later, it is over. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in recorded human history. But behind those 38 minutes is a story far stranger than the number suggests. By 1896, the British Empire had its hands on nearly every corner of the globe. Zanzibar, a small island off the east coast of Africa, was no exception. Since 1890, Britain had declared it a protectorate, meaning Zanzibar kept its sultan, but Britain held the real power. The arrangement worked as long as the sultan cooperated. For years, Sultan Hamad bin Thawani had cooperated. Then, on August 25th, 1896, he died suddenly. Within hours, his cousin Khalid bin Bargash seized the throne. The problem, under the 1886 treaty, any new sultan required British approval before taking power. Khalid had not asked. Britain's consul general, Basil Cave, sent word: step down or face consequences. Khalid's response arrived quickly. He refused. Not only refused, he began calling men to arms. Roughly 3,000 men, soldiers, palace servants, armed civilians, gathered behind the palace walls. Khalid even managed to arm a royal yacht, the HHS Glasgow, with a single artillery piece, anchoring it in the harbor. It was a gesture of defiance against one of the most powerful navies on Earth. Britain moved its warships into position and issued a formal ultimatum: surrender by 9 o'clock on the morning of August 27th, or the guns would speak. Khalid still would not move. The morning of August 27th arrived hot and still. On the British ships, crews were already at battle stations. On shore, behind the palace walls, Khalid's men waited, some terrified, some resolute, all of them watching the ships. Last-minute telegrams flew between Zanzibar and London. Khalid reportedly telegraphed the British consul directly: "We have no intention of hauling down our flag and do not believe you would open fire on us." The British consul's reply was brief: "We do not wish to open fire, but unless you do as required, we shall certainly do so." 9 a.m. arrived. The Zanzibar flag, a deep red field, still flew above the palace. No white flag, no surrender, nothing. At 9:02 and 45 seconds, the order was given. HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, HMS Sparrow, HMS Thrush, and HMS Raccoon opened fire simultaneously. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The palace, built from coral stone and timber, could not absorb naval artillery. Room after room collapsed. The small Zanzibari naval vessel, the HHS Glasgow, opened fire on the British ships. It struck nothing. Within minutes, the British returned fire on the Glasgow and sank her. On shore, Khalid's forces were disintegrating under the naval bombardment. Men fleeing through the streets of Stone Town, through markets, through alleys. Khalid himself did not wait. He fled the palace as shells tore through its walls and took refuge in the German consulate just a few hundred meters away. The palace flag, that deep red banner of the Zanzibar Sultanate, was shot away from its pole. A British sailor, without orders, swam ashore through the harbor and physically raised a new flag over the ruins. At 9:40 a.m., the guns fell silent. 38 minutes after the first shot, the war was over. It remains to this day the shortest war ever fought between two nations. But the counting of the minutes was never the most remarkable part of this story. Here is what history textbooks rarely mention. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was not a moment of imperial madness. It was a coldly calculated move, executed with surgical precision. Britain had spent 6 years building a protectorate designed to control trade routes, clove plantations, and, most critically, the last remnants of the East African slave trade. An unsanctioned sultan threatened all of that. The 38-minute war was, in effect, a message sent to every ruler on the continent. Britain's patience had a precise and very short expiry date. As for the casualties, the numbers were grotesquely lopsided. On the Zanzibari side, approximately 500 men were killed or wounded in those 38 minutes. On the British side, one sailor was wounded. He recovered fully. The disparity is almost incomprehensible, but the aftermath brought its own strange turns. Khalid bin Bargash, the man who triggered it all, was replaced immediately by a British-approved sultan, Hamud bin Mohammed. Khalid himself sat inside the German consulate for weeks, before being spirited away to German East Africa, beyond British reach. Years later, the British would capture him during World War I when they occupied German East Africa and exile him to the Seychelles. He was eventually allowed to return to Zanzibar in 1925, where he lived out his days as an ordinary man. The new sultan, installed by Britain, did something remarkable. He formally abolished slavery in Zanzibar in 1897, within a year of taking power. Zanzibar had been one of the world's largest slave trading hubs. The abolition was seismic. The war that lasted 38 minutes thus accelerated the end of an institution that had enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. That outcome, the tangled consequence of empire, power, and 38 minutes of artillery, defies any simple moral verdict. The British used the war to tighten their grip on Zanzibar, which would remain a protectorate for another 67 years. Full independence would not come until 1963. 67 years purchased at the cost of 38 minutes and 500 lives. History rarely balances its ledgers cleanly. When people call the Anglo-Zanzibar War the shortest war in history, they usually say it with a kind of dark humor, as though it were a footnote, a curiosity, a record in a book of strange facts. But 500 people did not experience it as a footnote. For them, those 38 minutes were not a record. They were everything. An empire moved its warships, issued its ultimatum, and executed its plan in less time than it takes to watch a film. And then the warships weighed anchor and sailed away. The harbor returned to its usual quiet. The cloves still grew. The tides still came in. And somewhere in the rubble of the palace, a flagpole stood without a flag. The Guinness World Record for the shortest war in history is held by two nations, one morning and 38 minutes that changed the shape of an island forever. Some wars last decades and change nothing. This one lasted less than an hour, and its echoes have never quite stopped.